It was a Tuesday morning in late October. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the air was crisp, typical for that time of year, and the terminal was bustling with travelers rushing to catch their flights. I've worked as a gate receptionist for over 10 years, so I'm used to the chaos. That morning, I was managing the gate for Delta Flight 2998 to Dallas-Fort Worth when a man arrived just as we were about to close the doors. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. He was out of breath, his face flushed, and his clothes disheveled, like he'd been running through the terminal. He shoved his ticket toward me, pleading to be let on the plane. I could see the desperation in his eyes, but the rules are clear. Once the doors close, they close. I explained that he'd have to rebook, but he wasn't having it. He started yelling, demanding to speak to a manager, his voice rising with every word. I called security, but before they could arrive, he did something unexpected. He looked at me, his eyes wide and wild, and said he was getting on that plane no matter what. Before I could react, he bolted past me, shoving aside the stanchion and sprinting through the security gate that led to the airfield. I froze for a moment, completely stunned. Then I screamed for help. Security guards came running, but he was fast, too fast. He darted across the tarmac, heading straight for the plane, which was already taxiing toward the runway. I stood there, watching as the scene unfolded. The plane was moving slowly, but the engines were roaring, the sound deafening even from a distance. The man didn't stop. He kept running, his arms pumping, his legs carrying him closer and closer to the aircraft. I could see the pilots in the cockpit, oblivious to what was happening outside. The security guards were shouting, waving their arms, but it was too late. He got too close to the engine. The suction was too strong. 1 second he was there running, and the next, he was gone. The sound was unlike anything I've ever heard. A sickening, mechanical roar followed by an eerie silence. The security guards stopped in their tracks, their faces pale, their hands covering their mouths. I just stood there, couldn't move, staring at the spot where he had been. The news broke later that day. Reports called it a tragic accident, a desperate man who made a fatal mistake. They identified him as a 34-year-old from Marietta, Georgia, who had been trying to reach Dallas for his sister's wedding. Witnesses said he had been stuck in traffic on I-75 and arrived at the airport just minutes before his flight was scheduled to depart. He had begged other passengers to let him cut in line at security, but by the time he reached the gate, it was too late. The plane was already closing its doors, and there was nothing I could do to help that poor man. I had been traveling for work nonstop during the busy season on December, constantly hopping between cities. By the time I reached Dallas-Fort Worth for my layover, I was exhausted. My flight to Portland was supposed to be my last connection before I could finally go home. It was late past 11 p.m., and the terminal was quiet, almost eerie in how empty it felt for such a big airport. Most of the shops were closed, the gates sparsely populated with a few other weary travelers. I grabbed a coffee from one of the only open kiosks and found a spot near my gate. The departure board confirmed the flight was on time, which was a relief. All I wanted was to get home. As I sat down, I noticed a man pacing near the window. He was tall and wiry, dressed in a rumpled business suit, and he kept glancing at his phone. But it didn't seem like he was reading anything, just staring at the screen, his thumb hovering over it like he was waiting for a call that never came. He seemed agitated, and his expression distant. I assumed he was just anxious about the flight. I put in my earbuds and scrolled on my phone, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't help noticing him out of the corner of my eye. He had stopped pacing and was now standing completely still, staring out at the dark runway. His reflection in the glass looked unsettling, his eyes wide and unblinking. I shook it off, convincing myself that I was just overthinking it, probably because of how tired I was. The boarding announcement came, and I quickly packed up my things. The man boarded ahead of me, and I watched as he sat in the middle seat of the row, right behind mine. As I settled into my window seat, I heard him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of other passengers stowing their luggage. I told myself it was none of my business, and focused on getting comfortable for the flight. Once we were in the air, everything seemed normal at first. The cabin lights dimmed, the hum of the engine steady. I leaned my head against the window, watching the scattered lights of the city fade into darkness. But then, about 30 minutes in, the turbulence started. It wasn't just a little bump here and there. It was constant, aggressive shaking that made the cabin creak. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, telling everyone to remain seated. I gripped the armrest, trying to stay calm, repeating to myself what I'd read before. Turbulence can't bring down a plane, but not everyone knows that or believes it. I heard the man behind me start breathing heavily. His muttering grew louder, more frantic. He shifted in his seat, the sound of the seatbelt clicking open catching my attention. I turned slightly, just in time to see him stand up. At first, I thought he might be heading to the bathroom, but his movements were too erratic. He stumbled into the aisle. As the plane jolted again, clutching the backs of seats for balance, a flight attendant rushed toward him, asking him to sit back down, but he didn't respond. Instead, he bolted toward the front of the plane, his hands reaching out as if searching for something or someone. The cabin erupted into chaos. Shouts, screams, the sound of seats creaking as people stood up. I turned just in time to see him clawing at the emergency exit door, his fingers digging into the handle like he was trying to tear it open. My heart was pounding, disbelief coursing through me. I couldn't process what was happening. Who tries to open a plane door mid-flight? A few brave passengers sprang into action, tackling him before he could do anything more. They wrestled him to the floor, pinning him down as he thrashed and screamed incoherently. The flight attendants were on their radios, calling for help, while the rest of us sat frozen, too shocked to move. When we finally landed in Portland, paramedics and police were already waiting at the gate. The man was escorted off the plane, in handcuffs, still muttering under his breath. As I walked through the terminal, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. I didn't know what pushed him to that breaking point, but the thought of how quickly things can spiral out of control and how close we came to disaster left me shaken for days. I was flying back home after visiting my sister on the East Coast. It was late, well past midnight, and I had a 4-hour layover at an airport I'd never been to before. Most of the shops and restaurants were closed. The terminal felt lifeless, and the only sounds were the occasional announcements and the hum of cleaning machines in the distance. I wasn't new to solo travel, but something about that night made me uneasy. Maybe it was the weather. The wind outside was howling, and rain lashed against the terminal windows. After an hour of scrolling through my phone at the gate, an announcement crackled over the intercom. My flight's gate had been moved to the far end of the terminal. I sighed, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. The airport wasn't huge, but the new gate was in an area that seemed oddly deserted. The bright lights and bustling atmosphere of the main terminal gave way to dimly lit corridors, and the further I walked, the quieter it got. By the time I reached the gate, it was completely empty. No passengers, no gate agent, no nothing. Just a row of empty chairs and the glow of the departure screen. I double-checked my boarding pass to make sure I was in the right place. It matched the gate number on the screen, but something about the emptiness is creeping me out. I glanced at my phone, considering whether to text my sister about how eerie the airport felt, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man approaching. He was wearing an airline jacket, the kind employees wear, with the logo stitched onto the chest. He looked to be in his 40s, tall and thin, with a neatly trimmed beard. He smiled and greeted me warmly, introducing himself as an airline employee. He explained that the gate had been moved again, and that he was here to personally guide me to the correct location. I hesitated. His appearance and demeanor seemed professional enough, but something about his sudden arrival felt off. Why wasn't there an announcement about another gate change? And why had they sent someone to find me instead of updating the monitors? Still, I didn't want to be rude. Maybe this was normal at smaller airports like this one. I thanked him and started walking with him down the terminal. As we walked, he made small talk, asking where I was flying to, and if I'd been to this airport before. His tone was friendly, but his questions felt a little too personal. When he asked if I was traveling alone, a knot formed in my stomach. I lied, saying I was meeting friends at the next gate. He nodded but didn't say anything for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me. We were moving further and further from the main terminal into areas that felt more like maintenance corridors than passenger spaces. The lights were dim, and the usual signs for gates and amenities were nowhere to be seen. I slowed my pace, pretending to adjust the strap on my backpack, and casually asked how much farther the gate was. He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, he said something vague about it being just around the corner. My unease was growing. The hallway we were in now was completely silent, with doors marked "Staff Only" lining the walls. I glanced over my shoulder, hoping to see other passengers or airport staff, but we were alone. I thought about turning back, making up some excuse about needing to grab something from a shop or use the restroom, but I didn't want to risk provoking him if my gut feeling was right. Then he stopped walking. I froze as he turned to face me, his smile gone. He gestured down the hall and said the gate was just ahead, but his tone had changed. It was flat, almost cold. Something in his expression sent a chill down my spine. I told him I needed to check my boarding pass and pulled out my phone. Instead of looking at the pass, I opened the flashlight app and pointed it toward the darkened hallway ahead, pretending to look for a sign. That's when I noticed there was no gate ahead, just a dead end. My heart was racing. I turned back to him and forced a smile, saying I must have misheard the gate number and needed to double-check with the information desk. I started walking back the way we came, keeping my pace steady but quick. He didn't say anything, but I could hear his footsteps following me. As I got closer to the brighter, more populated area of the terminal, I spotted a cleaning crew, mopping the floor near a cluster of shops. Relief flooded over me, and I called out to them, asking for directions to my gate. The man stopped walking as soon as I spoke to the crew. When I turned to look, he was already heading back down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows without a word. I stayed with the cleaning crew for a few minutes, pretending to ask about my gate while keeping an eye on the hallway. The man didn't come back. One of the workers offered to escort me to my gate, and I gratefully accepted. When I finally reached the correct gate, it was bustling with other passengers and staff, and I felt a sense of safety for the first time all night. Before boarding, I told one of the gate agents about the man. She looked concerned and promised to report it to airport security. I don't know what happened after that, but the whole experience left me shaken. I've always trusted airports to be safe, well-monitored spaces, but that night made me realize how easily someone could exploit the chaos of a late-night layover. I never saw the man again, and I try not to think about what might have happened if I'd followed him any further, but every time I travel alone now, I stay extra alert, and I never, ever trust someone just because they're wearing a uniform.